Charlotte Reynolds stood at the private terminal waiting for her hired boyfriend, someone plain forgettable safe. But when the cabin door opened, the man who stepped out stole her breath. He was nothing like what she'd ordered. Devastatingly handsome, unnervingly calm, and far too real for a contract. Their eyes locked across the tarmac, and she forgot how to breathe. This was supposed to be fake, a performance to fool her parents. But as he walked toward her with that quiet smile, Charlotte realized she had no idea what she'd just gotten herself into. The morning Charlotte decided to hire a fake boyfriend, she was sitting in her corner office on the 42nd floor, staring at another wedding invitation from a college acquaintance she barely remembered. Her assistant had placed it on her desk, with the usual stack of contracts and acquisition reports, but this piece of ivory cardstock felt heavier than all of them combined. It was the 5th one this month. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother appeared on the screen, complete with 3 exclamation marks and a photo of some banker's son she'd never met. Charlotte closed her eyes and counted to 10. At 28, she'd built a tech empire worth hundreds of millions, revolutionized cloud security, and earned respect in boardrooms across the country. But to her parents, none of that mattered as much as finding a suitable husband. The dinner 3 nights ago had been the breaking point. Her mother had invited not 1, but 2 eligible bachelors to what was supposed to be a casual family meal. Charlotte had watched them compete for her attention, like contestants on a reality show, discussing stock portfolios and golf handicaps, while her father nodded approvingly. She'd excused herself early, claiming a conference call with Tokyo, and driven home in furious silence. That's when she'd found the website. It appeared after a desperate late-night search, buried beneath legitimate matchmaking services and dating apps. Elite companionship services. The tagline promised discretion, professionalism, and exactly what she needed: someone to play a role without complications. She'd filled out the form at 2 in the morning, specifying her requirements, with the same precision she used for hiring executives. Must be presentable, but not flashy. Polite, but not overly charming. The kind of man her parents would approve of, without being memorable enough to cause problems later. The agency had called within 24 hours. A smooth-voiced woman named Patricia assured her they had the perfect candidate. Reliable, she'd said. Experienced with high-profile clients. Most importantly, he understood boundaries. Charlotte had wired the deposit without hesitation, relief flooding through her at the thought of finally having a solution to her mother's relentless matchmaking. Now standing at the private terminal as the plane taxied to a stop, Charlotte smoothed down her silk blouse and rehearsed her opening lines. She'd keep it professional, lay out the terms clearly. They'd meet her parents exactly twice, attend one charity gala together, and then she'd invent a graceful breakup. 6 weeks maximum. Clean and simple. The cabin door opened, and her carefully constructed plan evaporated like morning fog. The man who emerged was nothing like the ordinary, forgettable person she'd requested. He wore dark jeans and a simple gray Henley that somehow looked more elegant than the designer suits she saw in her boardroom every day. His dark hair caught the afternoon light as he descended the stairs with an easy confidence that made her stomach flip unexpectedly. When his eyes found hers across the tarmac, Charlotte felt her professional composure crack. They were an unusual shade of hazel, warm and perceptive, in a way that suggested he saw far more than she wanted to reveal. He carried a single leather duffel bag, and there was something about the economical way he moved that spoke of a life very different from the one she'd imagined. She forced herself to walk forward, extending her hand with what she hoped was business-like efficiency. He took at his grip warm and steady, and introduced himself as Lucas Bennett. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight roughness that made her think of early mornings and strong coffee. Charlotte found herself holding his hand, a moment too long, before pulling away, acutely aware of how her pulse had quickened. This was supposed to be a transaction. She'd hired him the way she'd hire a consultant or a contractor. But as Lucas smiled at her, with something that looked almost like genuine warmth, Charlotte felt the first tremor of panic. She'd wanted someone ordinary, someone she could control and dismiss when the charade ended. Instead, she'd somehow managed to order the most dangerously compelling man she'd ever met, and she had no idea how she was going to pretend he didn't affect her at all. Charlotte had chosen a quiet Italian restaurant for their strategy dinner, the kind of place where executives made deals over wine and candlelight without anyone asking questions. She'd reserved a corner table far from prying eyes and arrived 15 minutes early to compose herself. When Lucas walked in, she watched him scan the room with the same calm awareness he'd shown at the airport, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. He sat down across from her, and Charlotte immediately launched into the plan she'd outlined in her head during the drive over. Her parents expected to meet him this Sunday at their estate in Connecticut. They'd need a believable story about how they met, shared interests, future plans. She spoke quickly, pulling out her phone to show him photos of her family, rattling off names and occupations, like she was briefing a new employee. Lucas listened without interrupting, his hazel eyes steady on her face in a way that made her self-conscious. When she finally ran out of instructions, he simply nodded and said he understood. Then he asked her what her favorite childhood memory was, and the question caught her so off guard that she actually answered honestly. She told him about the summer she was 7, building a treehouse with her grandfather before he passed away. Lucas smiled at that, really smiled, and mentioned he'd been thinking about building one for his own kid someday. The word hung in the air between them. Kid. Charlotte felt something shift in her perception of him, a reminder that he had a life beyond this arrangement. She wanted to ask more, but something in his expression had already closed off professional and distant again. He steered the conversation back to logistics, discussing transportation and arrival times, with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Over the next 4 days, they met twice more to refine their story. Lucas proved surprisingly good at this, remembering details she'd mentioned in passing and weaving them into their fictional narrative. They'd met at a charity auction, he suggested. She'd been bidding on a vintage telescope, and he'd let her win. Charlotte found herself actually liking the story, even though she knew it was just another layer of pretense. But what unsettled her most was how easily he slipped into the role when they practiced in public. At a coffee shop, he'd reached across the table to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture so natural that her breath caught. At the bookstore, where they'd supposedly first talked about their shared love of mystery novels, he'd stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and understated that made her want to lean closer. Each time, Charlotte reminded herself this was performance. He was doing exactly what she'd paid him to do. But her body didn't seem to understand the distinction. She found herself checking her phone too often, hoping for his messages, replaying conversations in her head when she should have been reviewing quarterly reports. It was becoming harder to maintain the emotional distance she knew she needed. Sunday arrived with unseasonably warm weather, and her mother's inevitable text asking what time to expect them. Charlotte picked up Lucas at his hotel, a modest place downtown that surprised her, given what she was paying him. He wore a navy blazer and khaki pants, looking exactly like the kind of respectable, slightly boring man her parents would approve of, except he wasn't boring at all, and that was the problem. The drive to Connecticut took an hour and 20 minutes. Lucas asked thoughtful questions about her company, seeming genuinely interested in the security protocols she'd developed. Charlotte found herself explaining technical details she normally reserved for board meetings, animated in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. He understood faster than most of her executives, making connections she hadn't expected. For a moment, she forgot this was supposed to be an act. Her parents' estate appeared through the trees, all manicured lawns and old money elegance. Charlotte felt Lucas tense slightly beside her, the first crack in his composure she'd witnessed. She wanted to reach over and squeeze his hand, reassure him somehow but that felt like crossing a line she'd drawn for her own protection. Her mother greeted them at the door with the kind of smile that meant she was already evaluating every detail. Catherine Reynolds had perfected the art of making people feel simultaneously welcome and inadequate. She embraced Charlotte briefly before turning her full attention to Lucas, her sharp eyes taking in everything from his shoes to his haircut. Lucas handled it beautifully. He complimented the gardens, mentioned he'd read about her father's work in renewable energy, and carried the expensive wine Charlotte had told him to bring with exactly the right amount of casual confidence. Her father, Robert, appeared from his study and subjected Lucas to the kind of firm handshake designed to intimidate. Lucas didn't flinch. Lunch was served on the terrace overlooking the garden Charlotte's mother had spent 2 decades perfecting. The conversation flowed with practiced ease, Lucas navigating her parents' questions with a skill that both impressed and worried her. He talked about his background vaguely enough to be truthful, without revealing anything that mattered. He'd grown up in the Midwest, he said, moved east for work. Found the city overwhelming at first, but learned to appreciate its energy. When her mother asked how they met, Lucas reached over and took Charlotte's hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that sent electricity up her arm. He told their rehearsed story about the charity auction with such warmth that Charlotte almost believed it herself. She watched her mother's expression soften, saw her father's shoulders relax slightly, and felt a confusing mix of triumph and sadness. This was working. They were believing it. But every time Lucas smiled at her, every casual touch that was supposed to be for show, Charlotte felt herself falling further into dangerous territory. She excused herself to help her mother in the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. Catherine wasted no time. She turned to Charlotte with barely contained excitement, asking if this was serious, if Charlotte could see a future with him. Charlotte heard herself say, yes, watched her mother's face light up with a joy she hadn't seen in years, and felt the lie settle heavily in her stomach. Her mother squeezed her hand, mentioning how different Lucas was from those ambitious men she usually dated, how he seemed genuinely interested in Charlotte, rather than her money or connections. The words stung more than they should have, because Lucas was interested in her money, wasn't he? That's exactly what this arrangement was about. Except when she returned to the terrace and found him deep in conversation with her father about sustainable farming practices, something her father was passionate about. Charlotte couldn't quite convince herself it was all an act anymore. The afternoon stretched into early evening. Her parents invited them to stay for dinner, and Charlotte accepted before she could think better of it. She told herself it was to maintain the illusion, but truthfully, she wasn't ready for the day to end. Wasn't ready to get back in the car and remember that Lucas was going to return to his hotel and she'd go back to her empty penthouse, and none of this was real. During dinner, her father told embarrassing stories from Charlotte's childhood, and Lucas laughed with what seemed like genuine delight. Her mother brought out photo albums, something she never did, and Lucas looked at pictures of teenage Charlotte with braces and terrible haircuts, without a hint of judgment. He asked questions that showed he was actually paying attention, remembering details that connected to things Charlotte had mentioned days ago. When they finally said goodbye, her mother hugged Lucas like he was already part of the family. Her father shook his hand with approval Charlotte had rarely seen him show anyone. As they drove away, Charlotte glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her parents standing together on the steps, waving, looking happier than they had in months. She should have felt satisfied. The plan had worked perfectly. Instead, she felt hollow. Lucas sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out at the darkening landscape. The easy charm from earlier had faded, replaced by something more guarded. Charlotte wanted to ask what he was thinking, but she was afraid of the answer. Afraid he'd remind her this was just a job. Afraid he wouldn't. They were halfway back to the city when Charlotte pulled into a rest stop, claiming she needed coffee. The parking lot was nearly empty, sodium lights casting everything in harsh orange. She bought 2 coffees neither of them really wanted, and found Lucas standing by the car, looking up at the few stars visible through the light pollution. Charlotte handed him the coffee and admitted more to herself than to him that she hadn't expected today to go so well. Lucas took a sip, his profile unreadable in the dim light. Then he said something that made her chest constrict. He said her parents were good people, that they clearly loved her very much, and that he hoped she knew how lucky she was to have that. The way he said it suggested he didn't. Charlotte wanted to ask, wanted to know everything about the life he'd hinted at, but never fully revealed. But before she could find the words, Lucas checked his watch and mentioned they should probably get back. He had somewhere to be early tomorrow morning. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but it wasn't comfortable anymore. Charlotte's mind raced with questions she didn't know how to ask. When she dropped him at his hotel, Lucas thanked her, professionally, said he'd wait for her call about the next event, and walked away without looking back. Charlotte sat in her car watching him disappear through the hotel doors, and finally admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding for days. She was falling for him, for a man she'd hired to pretend to love her, for someone who was probably counting down the days until this contract ended and he could move on to the next client. The realization felt like standing at the edge of a cliff wind, rushing past, knowing one more step would send her falling into something she couldn't control. Charlotte drove home through empty streets, her mother's delighted voice still echoing in her head. She'd wanted to fool her parents, but she was the one who'd been fooled. Fooled into thinking she could keep this transactional, keep her heart safely locked away while playing at intimacy. Lucas had done his job too well, or maybe she'd just been too lonely for too long. Either way, she was in trouble. The next morning, Charlotte canceled her first 3 meetings and did something she never allowed herself to do. She searched for Lucas Bennett online. She found nothing. No social media, no LinkedIn profile, no digital footprint at all. It was as if he'd been designed to leave no trace, to slip in and out of people's lives without leaving evidence. The absence of information told her more than any profile could have. Whatever Lucas was hiding, it was deliberate. 3 days passed with no contact. Charlotte threw herself into work acquiring a smaller competitor and restructuring her executive team. But in quiet moments, she found herself replaying Sunday afternoon, the way Lucas had looked at her when her mother wasn't watching. The careful distance he'd maintained even while playing the devoted boyfriend. She couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was performance. On Thursday evening, her phone finally rang. Lucas's name appeared on the screen, and Charlotte's heart did something embarrassing. She forced herself to wait 2 rings before answering. His voice sounded different, strained somehow. He asked if they could meet tomorrow, said there was something he needed to tell her before things went any further. Charlotte agreed, immediately suggesting the same Italian restaurant. After she hung up, she sat in her office as the city lights flickered on below, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Part of her hoped he'd say he felt it too, this connection that seemed to transcend their arrangement. Part of her dreaded exactly that, because it would make everything so much more complicated. Friday arrived with rain, the kind of steady downpour that turned the city gray and reflective. Charlotte changed outfits 3 times before settling on jeans and a simple sweater, wanting to look like this wasn't important when it felt like the most important conversation she'd had in years. She arrived at the restaurant early again, a habit she couldn't seem to break, and watched through the window as Lucas approached through the rain. He looked tired, not physically, but in some deeper way that made Charlotte want to reach out before he'd even sat down. They ordered wine neither of them touched, and then Lucas took a breath and started talking. He told her about the agency, about how he'd needed money quickly, and this had seemed like a simple solution. He'd done it twice before, he admitted, both times without complications. But then he said something that made Charlotte's world tilt. He told her about his son, Ethan, 4 years old, living 2 hours north with Lucas's sister while he worked. The boy's mother had left when Ethan was 6 months old, walking away from both of them without explanation. Lucas had been raising him alone ever since taking jobs that paid well enough to support them both, while still allowing him to be present in his son's life. Charlotte felt something crack open inside her chest. All the careful distance she'd tried to maintain dissolved as she listened to him talk about early morning cartoons and bedtime stories about a little boy who loved dinosaurs and asked impossible questions. Lucas wasn't doing this for luxury or adventure. He was doing it for the same reason she was running a company at 28. Because sometimes you did what you had to do. She asked why he hadn't told her sooner, and Lucas's expression turned rueful. He said most clients didn't want to know about his real life, that it made things complicated. The agency advised against personal revelations. But after Sunday, after meeting her parents, and seeing how genuine their love for her was, he couldn't keep pretending. It felt wrong, he said, to let her believe he was someone he wasn't. Charlotte reached across the table and took his hand, a reversal of all those practiced gestures. She told him she didn't care about the agency's rules or what other clients wanted. She admitted, her voice barely steady, that the last few days had been harder than she'd expected. That she'd started feeling things she shouldn't feel, wanting things that weren't part of their agreement. Lucas's eyes met hers, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw his professional mask completely fall away. He confessed he'd been thinking about her constantly, that Ethan had asked why he kept checking his phone, that he'd almost called her a dozen times just to hear her voice. This was supposed to be simple, he said. A few weeks of pretending, then back to real life. But nothing about Charlotte Reynolds felt simple anymore. They sat in that Italian restaurant until the staff started giving them pointed looks, talking about everything they'd carefully avoided before. Charlotte learned about Lucas's childhood in a small Wisconsin town, about the scholarship that had brought him east to study architecture, about dreams deferred when Ethan arrived and changed everything. Lucas learned about the pressure of inherited expectations, about building something from nothing and still feeling like it wasn't enough, about the loneliness of success without someone to share it with. When they finally left, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming. Lucas walked Charlotte to her car, and before she could overthink it, she invited him to dinner at her place tomorrow. Not for planning or practicing, she clarified. Just dinner. He could bring Ethan if he wanted. She'd like to meet him. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his face. Then he smiled, really smiled, and said he'd like that. As Charlotte drove home, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, even though she knew they were heading into complicated territory. Her parents still expected them to be together. The contract still had 4 weeks remaining. But maybe they could find something real in the middle of all this pretending. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, because Charlotte Reynolds had spent her entire life being careful, being strategic, protecting herself from uncertainty, and now she was diving headfirst into the most uncertain thing she'd ever attempted, falling for a man she'd hired to be temporary, knowing that when this ended, it would hurt in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the risk felt worth taking. Charlotte spent Saturday morning transforming her sterile penthouse into something that might appeal to a 4-year-old. She bought building blocks and coloring books, cleared the glass coffee table that suddenly seemed dangerously sharp, and ordered enough pizza to feed a small army. Her housekeeper had given her a strange look when she'd asked for child-safe plates, but Charlotte had waved off the questions with vague explanations about a friend visiting. When the doorbell rang at 6, her heart was hammering so hard she worried Lucas would hear it. She opened the door to find him holding Ethan's hand, the little boy clutching a stuffed dinosaur that had clearly seen better days. Ethan looked up at her with Lucas's hazel eyes, his dark hair sticking up in impossible directions, and Charlotte felt something in her chest expand painfully. Lucas introduced them carefully, and Ethan whispered a shy hello before hiding partially behind his father's leg. Charlotte crouched down to his level, the way she'd seen her assistant do with her nephew, and asked if that was a T-Rex he was holding. Ethan's face lit up immediately, and he launched into an enthusiastic explanation about how this was actually a velociraptor, which was much smarter and faster and had feathers. Charlotte listened seriously, asking questions that made the boy's confidence grow with each answer. Dinner was chaotic in the best possible way. Ethan insisted on sitting between them, showing Charlotte how to build the perfect pizza tower before eating it. He told her about his preschool teacher, Miss Jennifer, and his best friend Marcus, and how he was going to be a paleontologist when he grew up. Lucas watched them interact with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite read, something tender and wary at the same time. After dinner, Ethan discovered the building blocks Charlotte had bought and declared her the best at making dinosaur habitats. They spent an hour on her living room floor constructing an elaborate Jurassic landscape while Lucas cleaned up in the kitchen. Charlotte found herself genuinely laughing for the first time in weeks, charmed by Ethan's serious concentration and wild imagination. When he asked if she could be his friend too, not just his daddy's, something cracked in her carefully constructed walls. Bath time and bedtime came too quickly. Lucas carried a sleepy Ethan to the guest room Charlotte had hastily prepared, reading him a story about a brave little dinosaur, while Charlotte listened from the doorway. Watching Lucas with his son, seeing the gentle patience and absolute devotion, made her realize just how deeply she'd fallen. This wasn't about attraction anymore, or even the connection she'd felt with Lucas himself. This was about wanting to be part of something she'd never known she was missing. When Lucas finally emerged, pulling the door mostly closed behind him, Charlotte was waiting with wine and uncertainty. They sat on her balcony overlooking the glittering city, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then Lucas thanked her. For tonight, his voice rough with emotion. He said Ethan had talked about her the entire drive down, asking if Charlotte was going to be his daddy's special friend, and Lucas hadn't known how to answer. Charlotte set down her wine glass and admitted she hadn't known how to answer that question for herself either. But tonight, watching them together, seeing Lucas as a father and Ethan as this bright, curious little person, she'd realized something important. She didn't want this to be temporary anymore. Didn't want to pretend for her parents while keeping her own heart at a safe distance. She wanted something real, messy, and complicated as that might be. Lucas turned to look at her, and Charlotte saw hope and fear warring in his expression. He reminded her they'd started this all wrong, built it on lies and contracts. His voice was quiet when he said he couldn't afford to let Ethan get attached to someone who might disappear. The boy had already lost one person who was supposed to love him. Lucas wouldn't put him through that again, no matter how much he wanted to believe this could work. The words hurt, but Charlotte understood them. She'd spent her whole life in a world where people made promises they didn't keep, where contracts and leverage mattered more than genuine feeling. Lucas was protecting his son the only way he knew how. She couldn't fault him for that, even as her heart was breaking a little. But then she asked him what he wanted, not as Ethan's father, or as someone fulfilling a contract, but as Lucas. Just Lucas. He looked at her for a long moment, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, and said he wanted to wake up next to her. Wanted to introduce her to his sister properly, not as a client, but as someone who mattered. Wanted to see if they could build something that didn't have an expiration date. Charlotte leaned forward and kissed him, finally crossing the distance she'd been maintaining since that first moment at the airport. It was gentle and tentative, nothing like the passionate scenes in movies, but it felt more real than anything she'd experienced before. When they pulled apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers and admitted he'd been wanting to do that since the day they met. They talked until past midnight, making plans that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Lucas would tell his sister the truth, introduce Charlotte properly. Charlotte would find a way to explain things to her parents, though that conversation made her stomach clench with anxiety. They agreed to take things slowly, give Ethan time to adjust, make sure they were building something sustainable before diving in too deep. The week that followed was both wonderful and difficult. Charlotte and Lucas saw each other 3 more times always, with Ethan present, building a foundation that felt more genuine than anything in her previous relationships. But her mother kept calling with questions about Lucas planning future dinners and hinting at engagement timelines. Each conversation made Charlotte's guilt grow heavier, knowing the truth would eventually have to come out. On Thursday afternoon, her mother called with news that made Charlotte's blood run cold. She'd hired a private investigator. Catherine said it casually, like she was discussing hiring a new gardener. She wanted to make sure Lucas was who he claimed to be, that his intentions were honorable. It was just due diligence, she insisted, the kind of thing any responsible parent would do when their daughter was getting serious with someone. Charlotte tried to talk her out of it, making excuses that sounded hollow even to her own ears, but her mother was firm. The investigator had already started working, had already discovered some interesting inconsistencies in Lucas's background. Catherine wanted to meet for lunch tomorrow to discuss what they'd found. Her tone suggested this wasn't optional. That night, Charlotte called Lucas and told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he asked what the investigator might have uncovered. Charlotte admitted she didn't know, but if they'd looked into the agency into elite companionship services, the whole arrangement would be laid bare. Everything they'd built, everything that had started to feel real, would be exposed as a transaction. Lucas's voice was steady when he said they needed to tell the truth before the investigator did. He couldn't let Charlotte's parents discover it. This way, couldn't let them think he'd been deceiving their daughter for money. Even if it meant losing everything they'd started to build, honesty was the only way forward now. Charlotte wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to protect what they had, but she knew he was right. Friday's lunch with her parents was scheduled for noon at their country club. Charlotte barely slept the night before, rehearsing different versions of the confession in her head. None of them sounded good. All of them ended with disappointment and betrayal written across her mother's face. She'd built her entire life on being perfect, on meeting every expectation, and now she was about to shatter that image completely. Lucas insisted on coming with her, said she shouldn't have to face this alone. They drove to Connecticut in heavy silence, Ethan staying with Lucas's sister for the day. Charlotte kept glancing at Lucas, memorizing the determined set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. Part of her wondered if this would be the last time they'd be together, like this, united against the world. Her parents were already seated when they arrived, her mother's expression pleasant but guarded. The investigator's folder sat on the table between them like a loaded weapon. Robert Reynolds stood to shake Lucas's hand, his grip noticeably cooler than it had been 2 weeks ago. Catherine gestured for them to sit, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Before her mother could speak, Charlotte took a breath and started talking. She told them everything about the pressure she'd felt, the endless matchmaking attempts, the desperation that had led her to hire someone, about elite companionship services and the contract, and how wrong it had all started. Her voice shook but didn't break as she explained that yes, she'd paid Lucas to pretend to be her boyfriend, to fool them into thinking she'd found someone acceptable. Her mother's face went pale, then flushed with anger. Catherine demanded to know how Charlotte could do this, how she could lie so elaborately, bring this man into their home under false pretenses. Robert's expression was harder to read, disappointment and confusion, mixing with something that might have been hurt. Charlotte felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Then Lucas spoke, his voice calm and clear, in a way Charlotte envied. He told them the arrangement had been his fault, that he'd needed the money, and had agreed to the deception. But then he said something that made Charlotte's breath catch. He admitted that somewhere between the airport and that first dinner at their estate, everything had changed. He'd fallen for their daughter genuinely and completely, in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or payment. Lucas looked directly at Robert and Catherine as he spoke about Charlotte's intelligence, her dry humor, that surprised him the way she'd gotten down on the floor to build dinosaur habitats with Ethan, without a moment's hesitation. He said he understood if they never forgave him, if they wanted him gone from Charlotte's life. But he wouldn't let them think their daughter was somehow at fault for wanting to escape their constant pressure, or that his feelings for her were anything less than real. The silence that followed felt endless. Catherine stared at Lucas like she was seeing him for the first time, her anger slowly shifting into something more complicated. Robert picked up his water glass, took a long drink, and then asked Lucas what his intentions were now. Not 2 weeks ago when this started, he clarified. Right now today, knowing everything was out in the open. Lucas didn't hesitate. He said he wanted to be with Charlotte if she'd have him, wanted to introduce her properly to his son, to his sister, to the real life he'd been hiding. He admitted he couldn't offer her wealth or status, or any of the things the men her parents usually approved of could provide. But he could offer honesty, commitment, and a love that hadn't been part of any plan, but felt more real than anything he'd experienced. Charlotte reached for his hand under the table, threading her fingers through his. She told her parents that Lucas was right about all of it. She'd started this for the wrong reasons, but she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Someone who saw her as more than her company or her last name. Someone who challenged her and supported her and made her want to be better. Her mother looked between them, her expression unreadable. Then Catherine did something Charlotte never expected. She asked about Ethan, what he was like, how old he was, whether he knew about Charlotte. Lucas answered, carefully describing his son with the quiet pride of a devoted father. He showed them pictures on his phone, Ethan at the park, Ethan covered in paint from an art project, Ethan asleep with his dinosaur. Something in Catherine's expression softened as she looked at those photos. She mentioned that she'd always wanted grandchildren, that she'd hoped Charlotte would find someone to build a family with. Her voice was still tight with hurt, but underneath it, Charlotte heard something else. A willingness to understand, maybe even forgive. Robert was harder to read. He asked pointed questions about Lucas's finances, his work history, his plans for supporting a family. Lucas answered honestly, admitting he'd made mistakes, but was working to build something stable for Ethan's future. When Robert asked why architecture, why give up on that dream, Lucas explained that dreams were easier to defer than fatherhood. Some things you couldn't put on hold. The lunch stretched into the afternoon tension, slowly giving way to difficult but genuine conversation. Charlotte's parents didn't forgive them, immediately didn't embrace the relationship with open arms. But they didn't walk away either. Catherine made it clear she felt betrayed, that rebuilding trust would take time. Robert said he needed to think about everything, that he wasn't ready to give his blessing to something that had started with such fundamental deception. But then her mother did something that surprised them both. She asked Lucas to bring Ethan to Sunday dinner. She wanted to meet the little boy who'd apparently won Charlotte's heart along with his father. Lucas looked shocked, glancing at Charlotte, before accepting the invitation with careful gratitude. It wasn't forgiveness, Catherine clarified, but it was a start. As they drove back to the city, Charlotte felt wrung out and strangely hopeful. The hardest part was over. Her parents knew the truth, and they hadn't completely shut the door. Lucas kept glancing at her, worry creasing his forehead, asking if she was okay. Charlotte admitted she didn't know yet, but she was grateful they'd done this together. They stopped at a coffee shop halfway home, needing a moment to process everything that had happened. Sitting across from each other in a quiet corner booth, Charlotte realized this was the first time they'd been together without pretense hanging over them. No performance, no carefully constructed story. Just two people trying to figure out if what they'd found in the chaos could survive in the light of day. Lucas reached across the table and took her hand, his touch as natural as breathing. He told her he was scared of losing her, scared of what introducing Ethan to her parents might mean, scared that he'd ruined any chance at a real future by agreeing to that contract in the first place. Charlotte squeezed his fingers and admitted she was terrified too. but she'd rather be terrified with him than safe and alone. They made a promise, then quiet and serious. Whatever happened on Sunday, whatever her parents decided, they'd face it together. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If they were going to build something real, it had to start with complete honesty, even when that honesty was painful.